Okay. So, out of the ashes of these riots rose two main groups, the Black Panthers and the Students for a Democratic Society. These were organizations of Black youth, and actually, I shouldn't say just Black youth, because it was very much a community effort. And the primary goal of these organizations was to provide the services that the government had been promising since the abolition of slavery that they still had not helped out with. The Black Panthers were known for running their breakfast and lunch programs for youth in the communities. And were they militant? Yes. Were they aggressive? Yes. Were they tired of the shit of racism? Yes. And they were trying to make a change that would be relevant for their communities. Now, this, of course, didn't go well with the government. And Hoover at the time was the leader of the FBI, and he declared that the Black Panthers were a terrorist organization. The music that came out of this time had a lot to do with funk, had a lot to do with James Brown, had a lot to do with being Black and being proud and no longer hiding. And again, it's this next generation, the first generation that moved out of the South, that worked in the factories and had a steady life. A lot of the adults did not want their children rioting and rebelling like this because they so valued the safety that was provided by the consistency in the factories. However, after World War II was over, and as the economy started to dwindle into the 60s, a lot of these factories closed, and families no longer had any income, and they couldn't get hired anywhere else. So factories that had once been for making munitions and turned into like the Goodyear factory or the Chrysler factory for making cars were now shutting down. And so you start to see economic decay and crisis. And the children of these people who worked in these factories, these children grew up with a certain amount of prosperity. They had the ability to do things like go to college and increase their skill base and their knowledge, and they had the ability and the resources to fight against racism and racist policies. So make sure you have a listen to the James Brown song. Also have a listen to Stevie Wonder, Living for the City, because he talks about how it wasn't always easy living in these cities because you work really hard and you're just hoping to get by. And it isn't always possible. Now, Stevie Wonder and James Brown were both known for singing very uplifting songs to get people moving and feeling happy. Stevie Wonder in particular, most of his songs were about love and lifting each other up. And Living for the City is darker. It's still got that same Stevie Wonder vibe, but it's very much about racism. So you start to see this economic decline. You see the rise of the Black Panthers and the Students for a Democratic Society, and then the government is fighting back and saying they're terrorist organizations. And really, these organizations were trying to provide some stability for communities. Have the war on drugs start. So, sorry, my kitty cat is playing with the plants. Get me from there. Thank you. So there is a cycle, a very real cycle that exists in oppressed and impoverished areas, and that's the graphic we're going to look at right now. So you have to remember that in the 40s and 50s, there were lots of jobs, and there was financial, that's supposed to say prosperity, in California. But once the cars factory shut down, they had this economic decline, and it led to these communities becoming very impoverished. So you go from having these like really nice white picket fence, American dream communities turning into segregated slums and ghettos. And poverty has a very real, measurable cycle that you can see in any community. We can see this in the communities here in Rutland, right? Like it's not just in South Central LA. So when you have systematic racism and you have poverty, people go to survival, right? You're going to do what you have to do to feed your children. And a lot of times that meant doing things that were illegal, because getting a job during an economic decline for an African American person was nearly impossible, because if there are white people who don't have jobs, white people get hired first. So that increases, that systematic racism increases the depth of poverty. So you start seeing communities and individuals turning to drugs, crime, and prostitution, which leads to prison. Once you're in prison, you can no longer get a job to feed and support your family, even once you're out of prison, and then you have further poverty. And you start to see this downward spiral that is based on systematic racism. And the war on drugs was just that. It was to continue this systemic racism that would oppress African Americans and keep them down, keep them impoverished. And I'm not trying to sound conspiracy theory-ist, but it really and truly was. It was a legal way to like when people are worried about survival, they don't have time to think about rebelling. They don't have time to think about changing the systemic racism that benefits white people, because they're too busy worrying where the next meal is going to come from, right? So this was a very, very real thing. And the war on drugs was meant to essentially attack the survival skills that African American people were developing during this time. So now the laws are getting harsher, the penalties are getting harsher, there's more time spent in jail. The statistics are unreal, the difference between terms spent for similar offenses based on whether they were white or a person of color. And it was very targeted. It was very targeted. Maya Angelou is a poet. This isn't a song. This is a poem by Maya Angelou. It is one of my favorites. Still I Rise. The imagery is very much connected to the history. And in the last line, she's talking about being the dream of the slave, and how the tenacity and the determination of African American cultures and communities to still rise after the kinds of oppression that they've experienced systemically. It's just beautiful. It's a beautiful poem. So I encourage you to pop over to the YouTube channel playlist, the YouTube playlist, and have a listen. Okay, so now we get to hip hop. The beautiful face you see on your screen right now is, of course, Tupac. I am a huge fan of his poetry. Hip hop started in the Bronx, in New York. It started as a form of disco music, actually. So it began in New York at house parties where people would spin records by isolating the breaks, so the melodic spaces between lyrics in rock, jazz, blues, and disco, and they often emphasized the bass. So these breaks, these melodic breaks, were being emphasized and played over and over again, what is now called sampling in hip-hop music, in the production of hip-hop. And rap. So people would stand up and begin to make like random rhythms, and they would comment in the moment on things that were going on at the party, and they also began to like dance in really unique ways. And this is where the term break dancing comes from, like this idea of popping and locking and isolating and doing things that were so different. It's because the music they were doing, they were using to create these samples were the breaks, the melodic breaks, break dancing. My mind blew when I learned that. So eventually, like jazz and the blues, it evolved into a style that commented on the status and the shared experiences of African Americans in the USA. And so early hip hop was still very much, you know, you start seeing the layering of all of these different kinds of music, from blues and jazz, in through funk, rock and roll, disco music, and you start getting this mashup that becomes this incredible thing called hip hop or rap music. And then you have the crack cocaine epidemic. So remember, you've got the war on drugs, and then you've got this refined form of cocaine that is even more addictive. It's cheaper, and it doesn't keep you high as long. And again, remember, that cycle of poverty, right? There's a direct correlation between poverty and drug use, right? And drug selling. So you start to see this epidemic. You start to see more people addicted. We already talked about this. The murder of Michael Donald is the last lynching in 1981. You start to see groups like NWA come out. Now, I'm going to take it back here just a little bit. I'm going to go back to Tupac's face. So you remember I was talking about the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers being a social movement. Now, again, they were organized, and they were militant in that they were fighting for their rights in a very structured way. And because they had been deemed a terrorist organization, a lot of them had to go underground. Throughout the United States, there were 21 heads of the Black Panther movement, males and females, and it was decided by Hoover that there would be a raid on a January morning that would hit all 21 members simultaneously, so that all of them would either be incarcerated or killed in action. One of the 21, one of the leaders of the entire Black Panther movement, was Tupac's mom. And so she was sentenced to prison. I think she spent 3 years in prison. And as a result of the trauma she experienced of poverty, of serving a jail sentence, of fighting for her people, she ended up addicted, and crack cocaine was one of the things that she used. And Tupac's life growing up with a mom who had been crushed again and again and again, just trying to fight for a life without racism, really impacted who he was. Tupac was actually trained in traditional acting methods. He was a writer. He was a poet. He did Shakespeare plays. He was very, very fine arts oriented before ending up becoming a hip hop artist and using his poetry to rap and get his message out to the people. So right at around the same time, you have other groups like NWA, Run DMC, different groups all over the States, but NWA was out of Compton. And you have Ice Cube, yeah, right here. That's, sorry, back up. Back it up. Sorry for fast forwarding. I wanted it to back up. Here we go. Okay, so right here, that's Ice Cube. That's Dr. Dre, right? Who worked a lot with Eminem and stuff. Anyways, Ice Cube wrote the song Straight Outta Compton, and the whole group NWA rapped it together. And it caused so much fury and chaos amongst white people. This is when the parental advisory stickers were invented by a very good woman. I can't remember her name, but she was so abhorred by the content. But again, just like the songs, the spirituals, and the slave songs, just like the blues and jazz, just like funk, just like rock and roll, these musical forms were established and created to tell the true story of what was going on. And by this time, South Central LA was turned into an urban ghetto. You couldn't leave a 10-block radius. You couldn't be in a white neighborhood. And these areas were surrounded by incredibly rich, wealthy, Rodeo Drive, Hollywood, Anaheim, where Disneyland is. And then you have this like centralized, gang-oriented, impoverished community that is riddled with drug warfare. You've got 20,000 deaths nearly to date. There's been nearly 20,000 deaths as a result of gang warfare in South Central LA, and the UN has never gotten involved once. Right? When we started seeing so many refugees coming to Canada and the States and to other parts of the world from Syria because of the horrible things the Syrian government was doing to its people, the event that was the catalyst to those people leaving Syria and becoming refugees in other countries involved less than 1,000 people. That is not to diminish the fact that it was a horrible, horrible war crime, but the UN was involved immediately. The UN has never gotten involved in the events in the urban ghettos of South Central LA, and they still haven't. And there's been nearly 20,000 deaths, which just adds to the argument that, you know, the height of, there's a film that I recommend you guys watch. Again, I think I've already mentioned it once, Bloods and Crips Made in America. And one of the people in the film, closer to the end, says the height of perversion is, the height of control is when you can pervert a group of people into fighting against themselves and staying contained, right? Like the gang warfare happening between Bloods and Crips is they're both African American gangs, and they're killing each other, they are fighting each other, and nobody else is getting involved because it keeps them oppressed, it keeps them in that cycle of poverty, right? So messed up. Now, Straight Outta Compton, again, is incredibly violent. It's an incredibly violent song. I do not offer a link that is censored because I don't think that as a white person of privilege, it's right for me to talk about NWA and then censor what I think is inappropriate. Please keep in mind while you're listening to it that it's based on truth. It's not necessarily that these human beings were drug dealers or, that it's not necessarily that they were drug dealers, drug users, that they were pimps, that they were in gangs. Some of them were. But they are talking about the reality of their life in Compton, which wasn't a choice. They were born into poverty, and many, many, many of them have died in poverty. And when you're listening to the songs, it's not about being it's not necessarily about being inflammatory. Like there is gangster rap that's, in my opinion, not literature. But I do look at some of the music of NWA as being historical literature because it's commenting on the horrors of their life in an urban ghetto. And what that looks like. So again, I told you that Tupac's mom served a jail sentence for being involved in the Black Panther movement. Sorry. Whew, almost done. And that he was classically trained. And one of my all-time favorite poems is actually a poem written by Tupac. Now, I love his music as well, of course, but The Rose That Grew from Concrete. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. It is only 8 lines. But it is so full of imagery and so full of hope. And a lot of Tupac's music is not as hopeful. It's got that really raw, um, dangerous feeling to it. And he's talking about the roses is the people who manage to grow through adversity, to become something beautiful through adversity. That even though nature's law, so he's referring there to the systematic racism, nature's law says it's wrong, but it learned to walk without feet. You weren't even given a foundation, you learned to walk anyways, and you learned to breathe fresh air, and you became something beautiful and full of hope. And I really think that as chaotic and as controversial as Tupac's life was, his poetry is that rose, and I look at literature as being that rose. And when people express their truth through art, despite the repercussions that it will have from communities that don't understand, the world becomes a more interesting place, and it becomes a more truthful place. So I think you can draw a direct link between slavery through the different kinds of music to the invention of gangster rap, and look at how all of these art forms have been about self-expression in really, really awful, tough situations. Um, and I think that the reason gangster rap got so extreme is because after decades of trying to express themselves and tell their story, they still weren't being listened to. And it culminates again in things like riots. What your assignment for this week is, you need to do some research into the 1992 LA riots. Before you do the research, though, without research, I want you to think about why you think riots would have broke out again in LA. Think about everything you've learned in these lectures about the history of African Americans, and I want you to make 3 educated statements on a blank piece of paper or on a blank Google document, like why you think they happened. Once you've written them down, you can go ahead and do a web search and see if any of your hypotheses were correct. Make note of anything that was way off base, like if you think that the LA riots were instigated by a herd of purple elephants blowing bubbles out their butts, that's going to be incorrect. So you can go ahead and mark that down as incorrect. But try and make an educated guess. What do you think led to the 1992 LA riots? And once you're done, make sure you record the sites, like cite your sources where you did. It's got to be like, you can start at Wikipedia, but don't cite Wikipedia. Remember, that's your diving board. So you want to go a little bit deeper into your citations, and you'll be able to hand it in at the LA riots. I'm going to leave you with the song This Is America, Childish Gambino. It's a wonderful jam. The imagery in his video tells this entire history. You can look at links that there's actually a link in the YouTube playlist that I made for you guys about the different symbols that can be found in this music video and in the song. Because racism is still very much alive. There's still a long way to go. Police brutality is very real. And as Canadians, we often think that racism isn't the same here. And it is. If you look at the way Indigenous people are being treated, the way people of color are being treated all across Canada, particularly in light of COVID-19 and the coronavirus, there's been a lot of Asian Canadians that have experienced hate crimes recently because they're being blamed. Like, even if they're not from China, which is where the virus did begin, we can look at that through the epidemiology of the virus, but it doesn't mean that it's like a Chinese virus, like Trump is so fond of saying, again with the racism. but there are Asian Canadians and Asian Americans who are experiencing very extreme hate crimes right now because the virus originated in Asia, which is just, again, ridiculous. Some follow-up that I would recommend viewing that will help you delve deeper into understanding this. Again, Bloods and Crips Made in America, you can find that available on Amazon Prime Video. If you don't have an account, or you don't have the ability to get an account, I would absolutely not suggest finding a friend who has one and maybe asking to borrow their login and their password, because that would be unethical. So I wouldn't suggest that you would do that. Sorry, I had something in my eye there. I would also strongly recommend that you watch Hip Hop Evolution. There are 3 seasons of it. It is fascinating. And they start in the Bronx in New York, and they go through the whole gambit of the evolution of hip hop and rap to where it is today. They talk about Biggie and Tupac's conflict. The only thing that I'm a little bit dissatisfied with is it's very male oriented, and there's a lot of really, really good female rappers, hashtag Missy Elliott. So that's my only thing that I'm not super thrilled with. But again, it's only the 3rd season and they're making the 4th right now, so I'm sure it'll be better. Again, if you don't have a Netflix account, I would not recommend that you find somebody who has a Netflix account and borrow their login, because that would be unethical. Anyways, I look forward to seeing you guys in the tutorial for some discussion and help with answering any questions you have about the assignment. Please let me know what you thought. I'd love some feedback, things that I missed. Please come and engage in the discussion. And yeah, I will see you guys on Wednesday. I'll post the time for the tutorial on Wednesday, and then make sure that your assignment is in and around Friday. It's a soft deadline. It does have to be handed in, but don't stress about it. It's meant to be interesting. So look into what instigated the 1992 riots in your opinion, and then see if you were right. Okay, peace out, homies. Love you guys in a super professional, non-creepy way. Have a great day.